The United States has Russia and China enrounded by NATO bases, each one a tripwire that will force the Russians and the Chinese into war with the United States, which is something they don't fucking want. And they don't want it because they cannot win. There is simply no chance of either of these powers defeating the United States in a conventional military conflict. At the height of the British Empire, British government policy regarding the Navy operated on something called the two-power standard. That was that they would maintain a navy as powerful as their next two competitors combined, so if these two state actors decided to team up against Britain, Britain already had a fighting chance. And this overwhelming military might was designed to ensure that there was just simply no point fighting Britain, to dissuade conflicts before they even started. The United States has 3.4 million tons of battleship in the oceans. The Russians have only 850,000 tons. The Chinese only have 700,000 tons. If the Russians and the Chinese decided to go to war against the United States still has more than twice as much tonnage in the water that they do. This is overwhelming. This is so much more than Britain would have had. And this isn't even including the United States' fucking allies, who would without a doubt join any war on their side. Britain, France and India have another million tons between them. There is no way Russia and China could win this war. They would have to go nuclear to have even the slightest chance of preserving themselves as sovereign powers, which they would do. It is a damn good thing that Hillary was not elected to be the United States president. But like our independent neocon article writer said, Trump isn't actually a war hawk. He's not interested in a hot war with Russia. The United States is going to be hiding behind its tariffs, as if the United States economy isn't a powerful weapon in its own right. Let's have a look at the sanctions the United States placed on Russia after the annexation of Crimea to see how the Americans can wage and win an economic war. These sanctions, in coordination with American allies, were placed on Russia in July 2014, so we're looking at a time frame of just over 2 years. So there are 3 types of economic sanctions. The first restricts access to Western financial markets and services for designated Russian state-owned enterprises in the banking, energy and defense sectors. The second places an embargo on exports to Russia of designated high-technology oil exploration and production equipment. The third is an embargo on exports to Russia of designated military and dual-use goods. For the Russian economy, sanctions are generally assessed to have helped exacerbate the macroeconomic challenges it was already facing, notably the rapid and pronounced fall in oil prices that started in the last months of 2014. Furthermore, the combined effect of these sanctions and the fall in oil prices caused significant downward pressure on the value of the ruble and increased capital flight. The rich people are leaving Russia. At the same time, sanctions on access to financing forced the Russian state to use part of its foreign exchange services to shore up the sanctioned entities, with draining their reserves. These developments forced the hand of the Central Bank of Russia, which abruptly ceased to defend the value of the ruble and hike interest rates in December of 2014. In response, Russia banned Western food imports, but this had a compounding effect as it led to higher food prices and further inflation. This was in addition to the effect of the fall in value of the ruble, which had already raised the price of imported goods and services in rubles. This is why Vladimir Putin's popularity has taken a dip in recent months. It's not a particularly large dip, and he's still miles more popular in Russia than any Western politician is in the West, and recent data confirms this. Russia is in recession with a GDP growth of minus 2.2% for the first quarter of 2015 as compared to the first quarter of 2014, and recent forecasts suggest a fall in real GDP to the order of 3% to 3.5% for 2015 and growth of around 0 for 2016. We are fucking their economy and we're not lifting a finger. The United States is so powerful that it can set rules that will ruin Russia. That is the level of control over the global financial system that the United States has. Do you fucking understand why when Trump was elected, they were cheering in Moscow? maybe Trump won't fuck them. Maybe Trump will allow them to have some kind of fucking dignity as a power on the world stage, which, frankly, they deserve. There is no reason the Russians should have to endure this. There is no reason the Russians should have to go through this. There is no reason the Russians shouldn't look out for their immediate interests, like every other nation does, and yet we treat them as if they are surrounding us. We are the villains in the story of how Russia is being treated. So Trump saying, you know what, I'm actually going to take it easy on Russia and relax the thumbscrew somewhat, maybe be a bit more humane to them, is a fucking good thing, because they were pressed up against the wall, and Putin, before the election, was warning of war. He was saying things like, I can't believe you're not more afraid because we are on the verge of war, because of what we're doing to them. And the reason that we are acting like they are the ones who are doing us the wrong is because they are just trying to get out from underneath our thumb. And they have done the right thing in doing so. And before I go on, I can already hear the cries from whiny beta males who are about to start calling me unpatriotic. You fucking unbelievable. So shut your fucking mouth and keep listening. There are plans in place to build a huge fucking gas pipeline through the Middle East. Harvard professor Mitchell A. Orenstein and George Romer wrote last month in Foreign Affairs that Russia currently supplies Europe with a quarter of the gas it uses for heating, cooking, fuel and other activities. In fact, 80% of the gas that Russian state-controlled company Gazprom produces is sold to Europe, so maintaining this crucial market is very important. But Europe doesn't like being so reliant on Russia for fuel and has been trying to reduce its dependence. It's a move that is supported by the United States, as it would weaken Russian influence over Europe. But this has not gone down well with Russia, which uses its power over gas as political leverage and has a history of cutting off supply to countries during conflict. It has even gone to war in Georgia and Ukraine to disrupt plans to export gas from other parts of the Middle East. This is no different to us placing economic sanctions on Russia when they do things that we don't like. Much of Russia's power comes from established pipelines used to transport gas to Europe cheaply, but other countries are now trying to get around Russia and provide new sources of gas to Europe. Last year, Obama spoke openly about the need for Europe to reduce its reliance on Russian gas following the conflict in Ukraine. The US also wants to use its own natural gas supply, recently developed through fracking, to undercut Russian supply, but it will be years before the US is in a position to ship this overseas. The US is not the only country trying to outmaneuver Russia, and this is where the role of Syria becomes more important. Before the civil war, two competing pipelines were put forward by Qatar and Iran aimed to transport gas to Europe through Syria. Now, I'm sure you're aware, Qatar are Clinton Foundation donors and Iran are Russian allies. So which one do you think the Syrians agreed to? Qatar proposed the plans first, but Assad refused. Iran proposed its own $10 billion pipeline, which unsurprisingly Russia backed and Assad approved. And I wonder why. The plan was signed off in 2012 but delayed because of the Syrian civil war. So this gives you rather more context to Hillary Clinton demanding that Assad be removed from power. Assad is a long-time Russian ally. He is suffering from Islamist revolts in his country that are being actively supported by the United States with the intention of overthrowing Assad. So it is entirely moral for Russia to go in and support their ally. It is the right thing for Russia to do, to not only go in and support their ally, but it's in their own fucking interests to maintain the tiny grip on power and influence that they have left. Because if Russia loses the influence that they have from their gas pipelines, what does Russia have left? This is why Putin is actually a great statesman. Not only has he expanded Russian influence directly beyond her borders, but he has protected his ally not once, but twice from American attempts to overthrow them. In 2013, when chemical weapons were found, who knew where they came from except when the UN investigated? It turns out they came from the fucking rebels, alright? by constantly painting this rosy picture of how the West didn't do nothing, and how Syria and Iran and Russia, they're just the worst, they're so horrible. Look at these human rights abusers. We're making excuses for the fact that not only are we fucking them, but we won't stop. And when we keep fucking them, we tell them it's their own fucking fault. Yes, Trump should go easier on Putin. They are desperate for him to do so. He will be able to get any kind of fucking concessions he wants. All he has to do is show Russia a modicum of respect. That's it. And we can get what we want out of them, I'm sure, at a fairly good fucking deal. And so I am consistently baffled when a progressive who doesn't ever talk about this sort of thing in any other capacity tells me that Russia are a threat. Woo, Russia, you've got to be scared. You're insane. You don't know what you're talking about. The only scary thing about Russia is forcing them into a position where they feel the only appropriate and sensible action is a nuclear strike. That's it. In all other scenarios, we have them whipped. So why force this to go nuclear? What happens if Putin sustains Assad in Syria and they build a pipeline? Nothing. We are already reliant on the Russians for gas. They will simply have another method of selling us gas. Nothing will have changed if we allow the Russians a bit of dignity. In fact, it is us who would be being magnanimous. We would be kind and humanitarian. We would be doing the right thing.
So Tapper goes on to say, the human rights community is calling it a genocide. The human rights community has also repeatedly destroyed the rebels that you are implicitly backing right now in your rant against the government. So there was a report from Amnesty where they said, oh, the rebels are torturing, the rebels are doing killings. In some rebel territories, they literally banned music. You weren't allowed to listen to music. But the picture you get from U.S. media is that these rebels are democracy-loving freedom fighters who are just trying to liberate the people of Syria because they care so much about human rights and altruism. That is complete and utter bullshit, but CNN apparently totally drank the Kool-Aid. So if you're going to bring up, hey, human rights groups are saying the Assad government committed some atrocities, you better fucking bring up that the rebels did it too, but they don't. They're only bringing it up against Assad and against Putin because that, again, that's the picture of the world the U.S. government wants you to see, so they hire people who are going to carry that line. Now, I'm not saying they're doing it as like a, mwahaha, we will mislead people. I'm saying they picked people who they know would fall for their propaganda and who would only go after the government and not talk about the unsavory rebels. He compares it to Rwanda. What's going on in Yemen is much closer to that than what's going on in Syria, because again, in Syria, it is a civil war. In Yemen, it is one side flat out slaughtering and massacring the other side. And then they keep insisting, the U.S. did nothing, U.S. did nothing, U.S. did nothing. Well, we actually did a lot. So we gave over $1 billion to the rebels, we armed the rebels, and guess what? They immediately gave those weapons to Al-Qaeda, because the rebels who we were backing were jihadists and Islamists. In fact, we covered one story. The Pentagon backed certain rebel groups, and the CIA backed other rebel groups, and then those rebel groups began fighting each other. So this idea of like, well, obviously, guys, the answer is that Washington needs to do more, and we need to intervene more. Except we've already been intervening, and it has been an unmitigated disaster. In fact, us intervening has given jihadists and Islamists more weapons and more money and more backing. Saudi Arabia and Turkey, two of our allies, are also backing rebels, and they are also backing the unsavory rebels, jihadists and Islamists. Now, Obama also recently set up a separate program to train Syrian rebels. At their peak, they had 60 people. That's all they were able to get, 60 people. And then when it really came down to it, the ones that were fighting ISIS, willing to fight ISIS and Assad, they were down to, quote, 4 or 5 moderate rebels. So we've been super duper involved, and what guys like Tapper don't acknowledge is your mythical, freedom-loving, democracy-loving rebel does not exist. There was just a story yesterday. The government was trying to evacuate civilians from an area in Aleppo. The rebels set the buses on fire. They set the buses on fire. And they spoke about chemical weapons there. The rebels used chemical weapons, and they're just blaming Assad. And then they spoke about Obama's red line. Obama backed away from the red line. Why? Because Assad turned over all of his chemical weapons. How do they leave out these basic facts? Assad even announced a few weeks ago, or maybe a month ago, hey, I will give every single rebel in Aleppo amnesty if you just drop your weapons. They're acting like, oh, slaughtering civilians, and he's like Hitler, basically. Is that what Hitler said? Hey, look, I just want to let everybody know, if you drop the weapons, you get amnesty. No, and this is something, and they also blame him, Assad emptied all the prisons. That's what he did. As if it's like, oh my God, how dare he, what a monster. Why did he empty the prisons? Because the rebels demanded that. They said, we demand you empty the prisons. So he emptied the prisons, a shitload of jihadists came out, and then they went right to fight with the rebels. And the rebels were like, yes, we finally got more fighters. But then they turned around and said, can you believe Assad, he emptied the prisons? No, you told him to do it, and he did it to try to make fucking peace. So again, by the way, am I saying I'm 100% pro-Assad and what a great guy he is? That's not what I'm saying at all. I'm sure he's committed atrocities. I'm sure the Syrian army, they're no fucking angels. But what I'm saying is, you have to look at all the facts, and you have to look at the reality on the ground, which is that the Syrian government, it has a secular socialist constitution. In the Syrian army, you have Sunni fighters, you have Christian fighters, you have Shia fighters. Who are the rebels? The rebels are fundamentalist Sunnis backed by Saudi freaking Arabia and Turkey. They're Salafists. They're jihadists and Islamists. So, but from Jake Tapper and Wolf Blitzer, you get this idea of, oh my God, the blood on the hands of Assad and blood on the hands of Russia. And you got nothing to say about Al-Qaeda rebels. Guys, one of the main fighting forces with the rebels is ISIS. Well, another main fighting force with the rebels, Al-Nusra. You're like, who the fuck's Al-Nusra? Al-Nusra is Al-Qaeda's official affiliate in Syria. And you know what they did recently? They were like, shit, everybody's on to us. We are changing our name, and since we are changing our name, we are disassociating from Al-Qaeda. Anybody buying this? I'm serious. So they rebranded, and the media in the U.S. like, they're moderate now. They're totally moderate. Moderate rebels. Moderate rebels, that's what they are. Moderate. So, Jake, you have to understand something, man. And sometimes I don't even dislike Jake Tapper. Sometimes he does a decent job covering things. But you're embarrassing yourself. You're embarrassing yourself right now. Wolf Blitzer, I mean, forget it. He's never had any hope. He's a robot. He's never said anything interesting, and he has no human emotions. You, on the other hand, had a shot at being a decent journalist. But you just sound like a goofball right now. You sound like you have no fucking clue what you're talking about. To anybody who actually knows what's going on in Syria, they look at you, you're like, oh my God, that's embarrassing. You basically took everything the Pentagon, the CIA, and the U.S. government said, all their talking points, which make no sense and are not based on the reality on the ground. You just fucking swallow them. You just chug it down. Oh, U.S. propaganda. Now let me spread it. So I come full circle and come back to my main point. I've never seen a clear example of Noam Chomsky manufacturing consent. The CNN is pushing only the picture of Syria that the U.S. government wants you to hear, and it is much more complicated than that, because their picture of it is misleading, biased, on the side of the rebels, and most of the rebels are Islamists and jihadists.